I guess the big theme is, and the old theme is, how can we get finance to work in a productive, inclusive and sustainable way, not just for the few but for the many. And that's an old debate. It goes back to the 1930s when finance was unleashed on an unsuspecting world with devastating consequences. And part of the success of the post-war period was, in a way, to control finance through various policies and regulations and rules at the national and the international level. In the late 1970s, with the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, with the deregulation of financial markets, there was a return in many respects to a world in which finance was not so much the servant of the real economy, but the master of the real economy. And I think many of the issues that are under discussion in the summer school and work that UNCTAD has really been doing for 30 years is examining the consequences of a world where finance becomes the master rather than the servant. And I think we very much hope that the participants in the summer school, and it's a mixture, it's not just people from academia, but also people from governments in emerging economies and from think tanks. Our broader constituency, that's the UNCTAD constituency. They will take away the idea that the consensus view on finance is only one view, and that there are heterodox approaches to understanding the links between finance and the real economy, which offer alternative policy options to the kinds of challenges that we've seen over the course of the last 30 years. And we use the term hyperglobalization in UNCTAD to suggest that the global economy operates differently from the global economy that was created after 1945. So we hear a lot of people at the moment with what's happening with the trading system and the behavior of the current US administration, that the 70-year system of international economic relations, the liberal economic order, is somehow under threat today because of the actions of populist politicians of one kind or another. And we say, no, that's not the case. The kind of order that was constructed in the 30 years after the Second World War essentially died at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s. The economies moved away from a commitment to full employment as a policy goal. Financial markets became the drivers of the economy, and so in many respects we're not seeing the end of a 70-year experiment. We're seeing the end of what we would call hyperglobalization, where neoliberal policies have become dominant in terms of shaping the policy agenda. Finance is the driver of economic growth in that world, and corporate power more generally has become an alternative source of governance to the role of the state and public policy in managing economic trade-offs and conflicting interests. So we use hyperglobalization to describe that new world that emerged in the 1980s, and in UNCTAD we've been tracking the consequences of that world, particularly for developing countries, but more generally too. And we see 4 real consequences of the hyperglobalization that all policymakers have had to struggle with in recent years. One is the growing inequality that is a consequence, we think, of hyperglobalization. A second one is growing instability. We see that today, particularly in emerging markets again. A third one is growing indebtedness. And the fourth one is insufficient investment. So, and what we try and insist on is these are not 4 ad hoc problems, they're 4 closely interrelated and interwoven problems. And the work that UNCTAD has been doing, particularly in our context, which is the developing countries, is to understand why those problems have emerged and what are the policy options that might be available to developing countries to address them. And I guess if, in terms of what we would like, what we think policymakers and the students could take away from the summer school in terms of one kind of big message that we've been trying to advance in response to these problems, is that developing countries in particular, but we would also argue developed countries, need to reclaim the policy space that they have lost to hyperglobalization. If they're going to effectively manage these problems and find a more inclusive and sustainable growth path, they need to regain policy space.